from Ibrahima from Invest in Africa. Ibrahima, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar. Good morning, good afternoon to you all, or good evening for some people who may be in other jurisdictions. My name is Ibrahima Aminu, Head of Business Development for Invest in Africa. Before I begin, I would like to thank our partners, Standard Chartered Bank, as well as the MasterCard Foundation for supporting us in bringing this webinar to you. Invest in Africa, as a local content-focused organization, is extremely excited about the African continental free trade area. And we believe that through our work in developing SMEs and developing capacity, we are well positioned to be able to support businesses to take advantage of the free trade area. Our three main pillars at Invest in Africa are providing access to markets through online platforms that we run, providing access to capacity and skills development, as well as providing access to finance. So these three pillars dovetail quite well to the theme that is of this webinar today: standardization, harmonization, as well as certification. And we're looking forward to having quite a robust engagement among the panelists and a very productive webinar for all concerned. Thank you very much, Omar, and I will hand it over to you to continue the webinar.
Thank you, Ibrahima. So really what I want this webinar to be is quite practical. I think we've got a number of business owners, SMEs, practitioners, etc. So we want to understand the practicalities of it all. So I think we all understand the theory. We've got one big market. We can supposedly move goods throughout this market in a seamless way, and therefore what we should have is economies of scale to be able to have large manufacturing hubs to service the continent. Obviously, the reality is a little bit different. So I want to go straight to the business realities, and I'll welcome Vimal from Bidco, which is a large group based in Kenya, operating in East Africa. And I wanted to hear from you what the issues you're currently facing, and what the procedures are in terms of standardization, certification, and harmonization across the East African community. Do they exist, and is it a burden, or is it pretty seamless? Vimal.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you very much for having me on board. I think when I look at it from an East African perspective, we have the East African community, which is already it's already a customs union, so it's not an FTA. So there are three stages. One is you become at one territory, then you become an FTA, and then you go to customs union. East Africa is already a customs union. Therefore, the customization, the harmonization, certification, standardization already has happened. So all our standards are now harmonized across East Africa. So that you have the same type of good standards that you've got. You've got the same type of phytosanitary certification, all that stuff required. So that's being done. We also have a CET, we got a common external tariff. That's one tariff across the region. So we've got a border around East Africa, which is common. Now, East Africa is 6 countries: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. And what we have is harmonized rates. So the rates for any product coming from outside is the same for everyone. So that's been done quite well. Moving around is quite easy because now you've got the same certification. If anything is brought into any of these countries, it finds itself, if it's manufactured locally, because we have something called rules of origin. So if the rules of origin are okay, and you've actually met the 35% rules of origin, then you can sell your goods in the whole of East Africa without any problems. Now, the issue around standardization is if some products are new or different and they haven't been standardized, you would have a lot of hindrances at the borders because they would say, this is not standard. It works in Kenya, but it doesn't work in Uganda or in Tanzania. And we've overcome that over the last many years. So I think that's where we would lead to. The issue that comes up and the problem that one would have as a challenge is if there's a dispute in what's being done in certification. And that's why I think for AfCFTA, a huge learning would be what has not been done in East Africa. What has not been done in East Africa is to have a certification body that is authentic, like SGS or whoever it is, to be able to certify that, yes, this is locally produced, it meets the standards, it meets the 35% value added, and therefore it's allowed to have free access. Now, this is where the problem comes in, where each country then starts saying, you know what, we're all equals, we're all similar. And I don't want this product to come from country X to country Y because we have enough production in our country. And that's where the whole issue comes up. And then countries become creative, private sector becomes creative, they lobby to their governments and say, put this barrier on. We call them non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers become actually, basically hindrances or blocks, obstructions to flow of goods and services. And this is where we should learn from what should be done in AfCFTA. In my opinion, the East African Community, CET, could be standardized across the whole of Africa and straight away adopted, start using it. Of course, we're not yet. In January, when we start off, AfCFTA is not a customs territory. It's not a customs union. And therefore, you'll still have differences in tariffs. But I think the learnings are what has been done and what has not been done. We should be able to really fast track across Africa and really speed it up. There are two things that are very, very key here, and that's political will. Political will amongst all the players to say, yes, we want. So East Africa, the political will was very strong. Everybody came on board and they got things done. When you delay things down to the people who decide on the ground, there will be hindrances because the person on the ground will say, I need to be in Kenya, I need to be in Uganda, and I need to protect my own turf. And that's where the problem is. So at the top level, you need that political will, and it needs to be driven down the line to everyone. So that's one thing. And I think the certification level, a lot of the barriers to trade have been removed. I would even thank, Trademark East Africa, who have actually been coming together to make sure they open up the tradeways and really get research on every single issue that's blocking a flow of goods and services. Then after the research, they make the policy and they bring it out to everybody, and everybody then, private sector in all the countries, get together and resolve and say, this is what we must have. And that's how it happens. So I think that's where the trade can really happen. Otherwise, Africa, as such, we're all in a similar boat. We've got 33 or 34 countries out of AfCFTA who are probably least developed countries. And some people might say we're least, we're higher. So I just think we need to standardize across the board a lot of things. We can adopt from what has been done in the RECs. The REC is a regional economic community. Like we have about 8 RECs in Africa, and they're all different. And then we have different people in different ones. Some people are in SADC, some people in COMESA, some people are in East African Community, some in the IGAD. And I think that's the important point where we actually need to merge them all and say, fine, now under AfCFTA, this one becomes better. So I think what I would suggest to all people is let's learn from that. But the opportunity is amazing. The opportunity is exciting. And it's the greatest free trade area in the world. And I think this is what we've got to make it work. We can't go and emulate Europe because Europe has taken years and they still haven't concluded a lot of things. But then free movement of goods and services already happened. So I just think that really standardization is a must. All together, have a certification body or bodies that certify independently from countries. Because if you leave it to different customs organizations and they become independent, they all want to block the other country. So I just think that that's a big learning and that's something we should adopt. Thanks, Omar. I hope I answered your question.
You've answered the question. You've raised a hell of a lot of points, which I'll get others to respond to. But Farhad, I mean, you're also in the East African community. You import from, you're based in Zanzibar, import from Tanzania, export to Kenya and the rest of the world. Does what Vimal's just saying resonate with you?
Yes, I share a lot of the same sentiments as Vimal in terms of the East African community and harmonization of the standards, which makes it quite easy to trade across borders. I think also I've experienced the non-tariff barriers. So our company, we deal with cashew nuts. We process cashew nuts in Tanzania, and we export also into Kenya. But with cashew nuts specifically, you have special bodies that regulate nuts and oil crops. For example, in Kenya and in Tanzania, we have the same, which now adds a level of, I would say, complexity to importing or exporting the products. But overall, things are quite straightforward. I would say that in terms of the AfCFTA, I think the important thing I share a lot of the same thoughts as Vimal, that the standardization and the tariffs, if they're all harmonized across the free trade area, then it really makes it easy for businesses to operate and to move goods across. I think that also access to information is important. If there are non-tariff barriers, for companies to be able to know what those are in advance. So having a portal where you can put in an HS code and know exactly what kind of permits are required in different countries importing or exporting.
But tell me, Farhad, is it working? Is the system currently working in East Africa, or are you facing difficulties?
I think the system does work. I think that the one challenge is just on non-tariff barriers for goods that might be sensitive within the region, and then having that information and being able to navigate those products. But I think that it's in terms of customs and taxes or just the ease, and now with the one-stop border posts across the region, it really makes the movement of goods quite easy.
Ola, I want to come to you actually to respond to what's been said in terms of getting the regional economic communities maybe to work together. So to be able to fast track this, the East African community has, by the sounds of it, pretty good policies, and they know where the constraints are, or at least the bottlenecks. And so I wanted to understand. Well, I want you to respond to this in terms of West Africa. Are things relatively harmonized there? And also to respond to some of the challenges about the non-tariff barriers. Tola, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Omar. So I'm just going to talk around a range of issues. So unlike East Africa, I think that in West Africa, the sophistication of the standards mechanism is not as far gone as in probably East Africa or Southern Africa. And I make this joke when I speak on webinars around the AfCFTA, that one of the things you realize is that the ECOWAS region is still not one of the most integrated recs yet, right? It's still not one of the most integrated recs yet. A lot more work can be done. But what I'll try to do in the next few seconds is set some context. So I participated in the negotiation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? Mostly because Nigeria was chairing the negotiations. So I'll give some context in the context of what the AfCFTA looks like, and then try to push some of the things that have happened in the last 12 to 16 months. So as most of us already know, Annex 6 of the TPT agreement states very clearly that the parties reaffirm their rights and obligations under the WTO TPT agreement in respect of preparations, adoption, application of standards, technical regulations. And so to a great extent, it still gives a lot of autonomy to state parties to pretty much figure out the standards. Now, and I agree entirely with what Vima said, which is that the risk of that is that member states would then start to all adopt individual standards. And so while you're using this AfCFTA to say, I want to trade amongst ourselves, there's a risk that if we don't put some more pressure on states to agree on a more standardized process, what will start to happen is that while we're having an AfCFTA that allows for freedom of trade, the actual implementation of standards and psychosanitary measures might actually in itself then impede trade. And so that's a risk. I also know, for instance, that when we're in the course of the negotiations, we said in Article 6.2 BCD that state parties should adopt some of the more common ASO and AFSCC standards, right? But the truth is not as much of that has happened. So I know at the end of last year that the Nigerian standards team agency announced a new adoption of 129 new standards. But the problem is that states are still engaging with standards as a very separate issue. So we don't have as much of the overreach role that ASO should play on the continent, where standards are playing across board. What we're still seeing is instances where different state parties are insisting on setting standards for themselves. And the risk with that, like Vima also said, which I entirely agree with, is that because there is a conflict, right? States want to control how much of the trade that they open up, all right, and want to claim a lot more indigenized of their local trade getting out. The risk is that if you also make them control standards, that they would use standards lopsidedly as a mechanism to keep out trade and lock out trade. And an example of that is what you would see with what's happening already with the rules of origin negotiations, right? So at the last meeting, one of the conflicts with the rules of origin negotiation is that state parties are still very conflicted on how much transformation must happen for you to say that something was in as an AfCFTA goods. Now, so imagine what that would look like on the standard side of things. So I know, for instance, that Nigeria still has very different standards from Ghana on a number of products. Maybe on things like cocoa, where there's some commonality, there's some unified standards. But when you go past that, the standards are a lot more divergent. And I think it even gets a lot more divergent when you start to spread it out across the continent. So when you start to look at instances of what the standards and technical requirements look like in South Africa as against Nigeria or as against Kenya, the divergence starts to even widen. So the question you ask yourself is, what would trade look like when we say that the AfCFTA allows you trade amongst the different member states, but I am a trader in Nigeria trying to get my goods into South Africa or Kenya, or I'm a trader in Tanzania trying to get my goods into Egypt, where the standards are different, where even when you look at the trading history is radically different, and so the expectations for the market is different. And so some of the pressure we're starting to put on states is to elevate the role of ASO and to start to adopt more unified standards. But of course, another thing you need to put in context is that the AfCFTA only asks states to start to liberalize 90% of their trade. So there's a number of 10% that's still locked in. And so one of the things that states will say is that, and so the issue with that is that what some states might prioritize is not what some other states might prioritize. So I'll give an example. Things like automobile manufacturing, it's a top priority for the South African market. And even in picking things like spare parts for automobile parts, spark plugs, fan belts, all those things that are component parts for automobile have a very, very high technical standards in the South African market. It doesn't have the same standards when you go to the Togolese market or the Benin market. And because South Africa needs to tie into the global value chain for car manufacturing, there's a preference for them to keep that high standard. So one of the conversations that I was in recently was about saying, listen, some of this manufacturing happening in Nigeria for these things are for components of repairs. So do you want to keep the same standards for what you need for components for manufacturing a new car as against the components you need for a repair, right? And so there's still all that divergence of how do you harmonize those standards across board. But I would say that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around the continent on helping to do two things. One is elevate an organization that can then be the standard organization for the continent. And I agree entirely with Vimal that we don't want a system where that comes from different states. The second thing I would say is, which a lot of work needs to be done, is to get states to prioritize in one document or the other that they will all commit to that. There's language here and there, but that commitment beyond what the language is more broadly is not yet a sin on the continent.
Fantastic, thanks, Tola. So what I should have done is really introduce the panelists. So Vimal is the founder CEO of Bidco, so a FCMG in East Africa. And we also heard from Farhad. So Farhad is the founder of YYTZ Agro Processing, which is a SME in the cashew nut sector based in Zanzibar, but operating in Tanzania and Kenya, and also exporting globally. And we just heard from Tola, who's the assistant chief negotiator for Nigeria. So he's been at the heart of negotiations on behalf of the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations. So at the heart of AfCFTA discussions. And I'm going to get back to you, Tola, in a second. But I'd like to hear from Dr. Coleman, who's at the AfriEximbank. So just to contextualize, the AfriEximbank have been playing a central role in terms of the AfCFTA. They've been one of the big drivers and supporters of the agreement. And I think the AfriEximbank have looked at it from a practical perspective. So obviously there's the political will that Vimal mentioned, but then there's also the practical elements to make it happen. Obviously, for the free movement of goods, we need great infrastructure, and I think the AfDB is pushing on that, obviously, in terms of building the roads, the ports, etc., etc. But the AfriEximbank has been doing a lot of work around this softer issue, should I say. So, for example, they're looking at, or they're even piloting a payments and settlements platform, so that someone in Ghana can buy goods from Egypt or from Kenya, for that matter, in local currency, and it gets settled in local currency rather than having to access euros, dollars, yens, or whatever international currency is they trade in. So there's the payment platform, but also I know that they're piloting a project in Nigeria in terms of harmonizing and standardizing quality control, and they're working with Bureau Veritas, which is another certification bureau. Vimal mentioned one earlier on. So maybe Dr. Coleman, can you respond to what's been said, and also looking at the practical elements in terms of making this thing happen? Dr. Coleman, the floor is yours. You may be on mute.
My apologies.
Go ahead. Maybe you can talk to us about the pilot program and what the AfroExim is doing and how you see these things evolving.
All right. Thank you, Omar, for having me. And good day, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I would like to start exactly from what Tola ended. Now, we must appreciate the fact that difficulties in complying with international standards and technical regulations actually is a major constraint to trade and for Africa's integration into regional and global value chains. The AfCFTA has been identified and has been lauded as a game changer, especially in the context of the continent becoming very competitive and then moving from where it is to a higher level. However, for us to be able to achieve the goals of the AfCFTA in terms of trade and industrialization, there is a need to have in place appropriate infrastructure systems, including metrology, standardization, accreditation, quality management, and conformity assessment. Without having these building blocks in place, we may end up realizing that we may be dreaming without actualizing the dream. Like Tola said, if the standardization and the checks are left with the participating states, we're going to have a lot of challenges, simply because trade, import, and export are going to be the way they've been. Your goods go to Nigeria. Nigeria says that they are not meeting my standards. Goods from Ghana go to Kenya. Kenya says that they are not meeting my standards. And therefore, although the potential is there, we may not be able to achieve them. It's in this context that AfroExim Bank has introduced a number of initiatives. One among them is what we call the African Quality Assurance Centers. Now, the fundamental objective of the African Quality Assurance Centers is to establish an internationally accredited African Quality Assurance Center, ACAC, for testing, inspection, and certification, basically to ensure compliance with international and technical regulations. The development of adequate conformity assessment infrastructure will be able to contribute to creating confidence for importers, would also be able to enhance the competitiveness and attractiveness of made in Africa products. In summary, under the ACAC, the African Quality Assurance Center, the bank is developing a pilot project in Ogun State in Nigeria that is focusing on food and agri products in partnership with Bureau Veritas, and to manage and operate the facility. Two, we are also currently looking into other opportunities to develop similar centers, one in East Africa and possibly one in North Africa. We are also collaborating with the African Organization for Standardization, ASO, and PTB Germany to develop an African quality policy to improve the quality of infrastructure in the continent. We are again collaborating with ASO on harmonization of standards in the automotive sector to facilitate the development of the African automotive industry. We are once again partnering with ASO and the ITFC for the harmonization of standards for pharmaceuticals and medical products. Now, it is important for these to be done in the sense that harmonization of trade standards would go a long way to facilitate the removal of non-tariff barriers and the implementation of the TPT SPS under the AfCFTA and facilitate its integration. The point that we are fundamentally making is the fact that whereas individual countries may have their own standards, the harmonization of standards across the regional economic communities is really a difficult and a challenge. And until we come to the point where the standards are harmonized, and therefore things from Nigeria to Ghana is not going to be subject to Ghana's own standards, but subject to one standard which is accepted and agreed to by all parties, we are going to have a number of challenges to be able to achieve the goals under the AfCFTA. Quite apart from the standardization, one of the key areas that you alluded to, which is also hindering trade across the continent, is payment. In the sense that for trade to take place, most African entities rely on the availability of hard currencies like the US dollar, like the British pound, the European euro. And we realize that it's become a stumbling block or a major constraint to effective trading even among Africans. So the bank introduced another initiative, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement Platform. Now, what this is intended to do is that if I am in Ghana and I am buying some goods from Nigeria, all I need to do is to pay for those goods in Ghana cedis. And the Nigerian will receive the Naira for the goods that I purchased without necessarily looking for where do I get dollars, where do I get euros, where do I get pounds. So you can trade in your own local currency. The exporter or the seller would also be able to obtain the funds in his or her own local currency. One other initiative that the bank has also undertaken in order to facilitate the effective implementation of the AfCFTA is the establishment of industrial parks. Now, we've realized that industrialization across the continent is relatively at the level that we want it to be, but the intra-African trade among African nations largely is dominated by light manufacturing and manufactured products. And so it is important for industrialization to start gaining momentum in order to realize the goals under the AfCFTA. So the bank is establishing industrial parks. Currently, we are working on one in Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Togo. And we are also planning to work on one in Rwanda, Malawi, and Chad. One other initiative that the bank, I may not even call this an initiative, is an intervention the bank has made. Now, in any free trade area, especially the one that we have, which is the beginning, not all the players are at the same level of development. And therefore, we envisage the potential fiscal revenue losses as a result of getting on board the AfCFTA. So what the bank then decided to do is to then introduce $1 billion USD AfCFTA adjustment facility. What the facility intends to do is to enable countries adjust in an orderly manner to sudden significant tariff revenue losses as a result of the implementation of the agreement, or as a result of getting on board and implementing the agreement. Now, this is intended to motivate as many countries as possible that are developing code fit and that are a bit scared in terms of whether they are not going to be overshadowed by the big players across the continent, to have that confidence and to join. So these are some of the initiatives AfrEximbank has put in place in order to ensure that we have a successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and to be able to achieve all the goals as stipulated in the agreement. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Coleman, just quickly, and maybe either yourself or Tola can take this one, but if I understand correctly, so the whole standardization issue will not be left to governments. It's going to be left to, I suppose, the Secretariat or the AU. Is that right?
Yes, as my colleagues have already alluded to, leaving this to government is likely to be another constraint. So as an institution, what we are aiming at is to be able to pilot this one in Ogun State, and then move on from there to other regions of the continent, and eventually have one harmonized standard, agreeable and accepted by all parties. That is the only way that AfCFTA can function effectively to realize its aspirations.
But who's taking the lead on that?
Let me give context, right? Just a more context. So the TPT Annex of the AfCFTA agreement, Article 6 says, and I'll just use the exact language, the state parties reaffirm their right and obligation under the WTO TPT agreement in respect of preparation, adoption, and application of standards, technical regulation, conformity assessment, and related activities. So basically, it gives the states the powers, the state parties the right to. However, Article 5 says that the state parties will cooperate in the implementation of the standards and technical regulations and conformity. However, Article 6.2 BCD then calls on them to adopt the harmonized African standard by ASO and AfCFTA. So basically, it's like every international agreement. We're saying you still have it's a sovereign issue. You still have the sovereignty to protect your citizens, to set standards. However, we want you to, we all agree to cooperate together on this. And beyond that is, there are some ASO standards and some AfCFTA standards that we all agree to adopt. So that's the basics of how it is. So what will happen is people like the AfrEximbank, the UNECA, and the AU, and the AfCFTA Secretariat will start to then work with member states together to start to push to adopt those central standards.
Excellent, thank you. So one last question, Dr. Coleman. Because I know that I've been given a draft report under embargo, so I won't talk too much about it, by the AfrEximbank. It's your annual trade report, and I think the crux of it is around informal cross-border trade. So and where the informal sector is obviously plays a large part of our economies and of intra-Africa trade. So this whole standardization certification, is it going to hamper informal trade? How do you take into consideration the needs of the very small, so the micro and small businesses out there?
Thank you, Omar. I am not too sure which version of the African Trade Report you are holding, because as far as I'm concerned, and I'm an active participant in terms of writing that report, the current version, with 2020 edition, is yet to go public.
No, I said it's
Be
under
that as
embargo.
it
I
may.
haven't seen it. It's a draft. I've just saw a very rough draft. But basically, what I'm saying is informal trade forms the basis of that report. So the informal sector is very important. So how do we make sure that we don't hamper small businesses by extra administrative procedures such as standardization, harmonization, etc.?
I am not too sure that the harmonization of standards will be hurting the informal sector, and especially informal cross-border trade, Now, if you look at that report very carefully, what that report intended to achieve is to see whether we could, as a continent, develop a common framework to capture informal cross-border trade. That is a key message that the report is trying to amplify. Is there a way that we could try and bring into the formal sphere and to be able to capture the data that is relating to trade flows in the informal sector? The harmonization of standards, it is not likely to hinder informal cross-border trade activities. What I think is likely to happen, that in the medium to long term, we are hoping to formalize. You and I will know that there are several reasons as to why people go through informal routes or decide to go through the informal cross-border arrangements. There are several reasons. So what the bank is doing, even in that study, is to try and see what are the challenges that is motivating the flow of informal cross-border trade. What is motivating the participants in the sector? How can we as an institution intervene in order to ensure that they are comfortable in ensuring that the data flows and whatever they are doing are captured? In terms of the standardization that they would have to meet, that will be possibly a medium to long-term objective, because the informal cross-border trade, cross-border players that we are looking at sometimes are entities or people who do not even have the initial capital to be able to undertake certain activities. These are small businesses trying to make ends meet and trying to ensure that their livelihoods are kept intact. But as when the time is right and such businesses grow and become big players, then we can be talking about the standardization issues. Mind you, the borders that we have on the continent, I am from Ghana, at the border of Cote d'Ivoire, Elubo, and then at the border of Aplau in Togo. These are family people who are just divided by seemingly artificial lane or line. And so we may not be able to control that so much. However, the big players in the informal cross-border trade arena could be captured in terms of standardization and the rest. But the small ones would continue to operate, that we may not be able to capture them in this big whole grandiose formal arrangement that we are referring to.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Thank you. So we're going to go to our last panelist who's been very patient, Bernie from Unilever. So Bernie's actually had experience globally. So he was in the States, he was in Nigeria, he's now in Ghana. He's not necessarily speaking on behalf of Unilever, but he's very well versed around this issue. So Bernie, I mean, when you've heard all our different panelists there and working for a big multinational company and having experienced both Ghana and Nigeria, so what are your thoughts in terms of what can be done to make sure that trade between ECOWAS countries, to start off with, but between Africa is facilitated, in terms of you, for example, yourselves with a big manufacturing hub in Ghana, being able to service the whole region in West Africa?
Good. Thank you very much, Omar. And it's been quite promising to hear the feedback from on the team here. I just want to hit on a few points from Tolu and Mr. Coleman. The approaches from the Africa Standards Organization would be extremely welcome, and that of the Pan-Africa Payment Settlement Program. Because the challenges that at least I've experienced as I've worked here in West Africa, moving goods from an import or from an export perspective is not the simplest of activities, and also managing the payments and trying to obtain dollars or pounds in order to manage those payments is also a challenge. So getting that done, which then allows an improvement in terms of our quality and our safety standards of those goods, and a harmonization, so I can have it tested in Ghana or have it tested in Nigeria, and I can easily transport either way in terms of the selling of goods. So this will help streamline our businesses. It'll bring a degree of efficiencies that is internally and also externally, and it also allows us to have one ways of working versus the multiple approaches that you can see if you were to look just within Ghana, Nigeria, even if I started expanding into Togo or to Cote d'Ivoire, et cetera. So, the elements of the AfCFTA, are definitely quite promising, and having this landed where it is executable, and I hear some of the challenges raised as you go from country to country, state to state, but I'm bringing that into one framework would definitely streamline and it will bring a bit more structure if I just look at the ECOWAS element of West Africa. So it's very promising, it's exciting, and I see a very strong future getting this right moving forward.
So when we had a brief chat away from our audience here, you're mentioning, so I was asking you about your experience in the US, and when you're talking to your colleagues in the US, you're telling me that they're surprised by the I don't want to say laborious process, but ultimately over there, everything is digitized. You fill a form online, and that enables the free movement of goods between, obviously within the US, it's easy, but between Mexico and or Latin America, or Mexico and America. Whilst so this is something that you encourage, that everything needs to be digitized, and to make it easy, because you've got staff who are just looking at paperwork or dedicated just making sure that the paperwork is right.
Yeah, so the infrastructure in the US, Mexico, Canada has been developed over generations. So they have a significant head start over that of what's happening here in West Africa, or that of Africa. So I think the efforts are starting here, and piggy banking on the learnings from the West will definitely bring an opportunity. I think the frameworks of this program, of that of ECOWAS and others, help put that into place. So there's less distinguishing factors as you go country to country. So yes, things are simpler there. My peers back home, do display a different story than what I've experienced in West Africa. However, I do see progress coming and picking up from those learnings. So it's sort of comparing an apple to an orange, but and I think over time the learnings from there are being applied in West Africa.
Fantastic. So we're going to take questions in a 2 or 3 minutes. So if you've got questions to ask, please share them, and and the team will share them with me. So so tell me, Vimal, when you look operating your business, obviously East Africa, pretty seamless. You understand the market, some difficulties in terms of non-trade barriers. But the AfCFTA, does it excite you? And are you looking at expanding in other regions, be it south of Kenya, such as Zambia, Zimbabwe, and others, or even West Africa, which is ultimately relatively far, but Nigeria is obviously, or even North Ethiopia, which is an interesting market, even though it's relatively closed right now?
Yeah, so I think we're very, very excited with AfCFTA. I think it's a good move. Obviously, when we start in January, it doesn't mean everything's just going to free flow. It's going to take some time. And I think the biggest opportunity there is the large market. It's unanimous in terms of what it is, and people are similar. And therefore, the demand will still be there. And I think that's important for us. So we're into manufacturing and agribusiness and all that stuff. And our goal is to go all over Africa, not only East, but Eastern, Southern, Central, and West Africa too. So I think that's going to be the great opportunity. So we're excited with it. I think these negotiations always happen and everybody looks at positions, but technical barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers are something we should watch out for, where things can actually fail. And if we really have, and I say this openly, if we really have the political will to really unify everything, we'll have less of problems of fighting and more of saying, let's open up and become equal. So I think some of the questions that are coming on board are about a free trade area. Right now it's AfCFTA, it's a free trade area. It's not a customs union. And therefore you can be in 2-3 different free trade areas, right? COMESA is a free trade area and you can be in different free trade areas, but in a customs union, you can't be in 2 customs union. So you need to be in 1. And therefore ESC doesn't have a problem in joining AfCFTA. But I think the issue around this would be that we need to make sure that everything is simplified and the rules are there. Number 2, I think in Africa, we've been exporting a lot of our raw materials live and raw. And I think this is a great opportunity to do value addition in Africa. And therefore we can trade, and our most trade with Africa will be manufactured goods or produced goods. And I think that's what's important. And that's where logistics becomes a huge opportunity. So if somebody is playing into logistics, within Africa, we don't have good logistics. If I want to export something to Nigeria or Ghana, the costs are prohibitive. It's far cheaper to trade with China because the freight rates are much lower. And that's a great opportunity, in my opinion, to start looking at that in a bigger way. So we're excited as a group where we think that, Africa will have demand. We're at 1.3 billion people. We're going to go to 2.5 billion people by 2050. And we're long-term players. Only thing is that for Africa, let's not have harvesters coming to Africa. I think we need planters to come and plant and be there for the longer term. That's what the opportunity is. And I think that's where a lot of things can open up. So AfCFTA, I see it as opportunity. There will be issues. There will be issues around REX and this and that, and a lot of understanding. And I think also the informal trade. You talk about informal trade and people are talking about informal trade. That will be cut out because once you go digital, a lot of digital currencies or digital whatever comes up, then it all becomes apparently transparent. So I think that's the great excitement. We're looking forward to it.
Farhad, what about yourself? I mean, does it change much from your end? And what recommendations would you have to the policymakers in terms of certification, standardization, quality control, or you think things are working from your end to be able to integrate global markets?
Yeah. Thanks, Omar. I think the opportunity is immense with the AfCFTA. If I just look at our particular value chain with cashews, Africa produces 60% of the world's cashews now, with less than 10% being processed on the continent. You have African countries importing cashews out of Vietnam, out of India, that were probably harvested in Africa. And so those are things that I think can improve through value addition, the ability for us to process our own products into saleable consumables, because there is demand on the continent, and as Vimal mentioned, that demand is going to continue to grow. I would say that for the standardization and the quality standards is something that is very important. I mean, for companies that like us who have to adhere to global standards, I feel that we won't have necessarily a large challenge accessing African markets. I think that when you are used to cumbersome standards requirements in terms of exporting to Europe or North America, that Africa should be quite simple. But I think that it's important to have those things be clear, and to allow opportunity for younger SMEs to be able to access this opportunity.
Tola, very quickly before we go to our questions from the audience, in terms of, I mean, we spoke about political will, but how do you think the negotiations have gone? Do you think we're progressing relatively quickly? You think that the political will is there? What are your thoughts from behind the scenes? I mean, you're the one who's there negotiating and listening to what all the other countries have got to say.
So I think it's a mix. I think it's the boldest expression of political will on the continent to actually integrate trade. I don't think we've had anything. So we've had the Abuja Treaty, we've had the Lagos Treaty, we've had the Rex, but we've never had such a bold statement about trying to integrate trade on the continent. This is the boldest, especially when you consider the fact that there's also a secretariat set up in Ghana for the AfCFTA, which basically gives an institutional system to actually try and integrate trade on the continent. So it's the most deliberate attempt that the continent has made on the areas of trade. Previously to now, it was always subsumed under the socio-political or the political agenda, the African Union or the ECOWAS or any of the Rex. But now it's a very standalone international trade agenda. That's one. The second thing to say is that there's also a realization of the responsibility that is involved, right? So it's easy to negotiate an agreement. It's a different thing to start to implement the agreement. And I think that's what state parties are beginning to see now. So it was easy to say, let's negotiate the agreement. It was easy to say, well, it wasn't easy. It took several years, but it was a lot easier to say, let's negotiate the agreement and get all the state parties to dot the I's and cross the T's. But now we get into implementation, and that's where the hard work is. So for instance, in Nigeria, there's a national action group, which is now being replicated in a lot of member states, which basically just helps every state part, the private sector, the government industry, agencies, to start to prepare for how a setup for AfCFTA would look like. And states are beginning to see that responsibility. I would also say that there's been a slight setback with the death of Ambassador Chiedo Osakwe, may he so rest in peace, who was Nigeria's chief trade negotiator and who basically birthed the entire AfCFTA agreement. So coming from his experience from the WTO, being the most senior director of the WTO for the longest time, he brought all that experience to the continent. So that, I'm sure, did a lot of work in helping birth the agreement. So his death, of course, was a setback to that entire process. But three things I would say, and I'll probably cap up with this. The first is that we're seeing a possibility of having Nigeria, or a woman and Nigerian be the first DG of the WTO, the first Nigerian and female DG of the WTO, which is a strong possibility. So what that means also is that there's a possibility of a strong alignment on getting away some of the policy conflicts between the AfCFTA and the WTO. So one of the biggest problems we've always had to deal with is that a lot of states have double obligations, both under the AfCFTA and under the WTO agreement, and that the WTO agreement already restricts the policy space that a number of the member states and African member states have for being flexible within the AfCFTA. The second thing that also does for us is it starts to center the conversation around development, which is one of the things that developing countries have always complained about, that even though we have a WTO which talks about development, that there's not much has been done apart from lip service to the work of development. So that'll be interesting to see how that also plays out. The last thing I would say is that I think what we're going to start to see in the next few months is, and I know we all say January 2021. I make a joke to say I hope they don't defer it by January 2021 because so much work still has to be done to get the member states to where it is. But this is my sense. My sense is to say what we need to do is to start. Like the moment we start, we will make some mistakes, yes. But the only way to figure out all these issues is to start, because with COVID, with the COVID problems, with the extent of big state of some big state actors, with the extent of some manufacturing groups, if we keep deferring the start to trading within the bloc, well, we would not find the things we need to figure out. We would not start to test run the process, and we would actually never get to the point. So I think there's a lot of motivation. I know that the AfCFTA Secretariat Secretary General was in Nigeria some weeks back, just talking to state players around what needs to be done. So I think that's already happening. And I think one of the strongest implementation parts is that there's already a lot of work being done into building out the Secretariat. And the truth is that once the Secretariat built out and we start to do some trade, it's a lot easier to start to push past. So we're moving from the Rex, which is a different monster that has those political, socio-political, and cultural, to a purely trade and economic type entity that has a broad region mandate across the continent. Of course, the one thing to say to undertone that is that we still got to be careful that we don't erode state sovereignty in the process and ensure that states still feel like they're in charge of their trade of the trade in their continent. But I'm very, very excited and very positive about what's possible with the AfCFTA.
Okay, I've actually got a question from the audience, and I think it's targeted at you. It's about building institutional capacity.
What do you think?
It's about building institutional capacity, so making sure that that the people within the different countries and institutions understand the standards and the new regulation across the multiple markets. So actually, we had an SME last month, Monica Musonda from Zambia. And she said one of the problems is people at customs don't necessarily understand the regulation, and therefore that becomes a constraint because they block goods or they delay the movement of goods. So that building that institutional capacity, is that taking place? Is that within the framework?
So yeah, so definitely. I think that's happening in four broad areas, right? Maybe even 5. One of the areas that's beginning to happen is institutions like UNECA. I think we've got to shout out UNECA for the work that they already do on the continent and supporting that, and institutions like AfCFTA also. So I know also that AfCFTA has some capacity around supporting with the legal frame and with the legal implementation in some of the member states. So I know that we're in conversations earlier this year with someone from the AfCFTA Bank about training lawyers on the continent in Nigeria about understanding the rules. So I think there's a lot of that happening in institutional groups, guys, people like AFDB, AfCFTA and UNECA already providing support for institutional development. Even WTO, well, would have been, but of course there's some challenges now because of the fact that the WTO is in the transitional cycle. That's one. And the second bulk of what's happening is the AfCFTA Secretariat is doing a lot of work. And one thing to say is that because of how the AfCFTA Secretariat was set up, because it was member states negotiating together and then agreeing on the Secretariat, what's happening is that a lot of that institutional capacity of understanding it actually lies with the people who negotiated the agreement, like myself. And those people are in different member states. So what we're seeing is that the AfCFTA Secretariat is going to work with those negotiators to work with their own member countries to do a lot of work to explain. So for instance, 4 times now, so apart from the fact that we had a full national action committee in Nigeria, for instance, where we got all the private sector players, we got all the industry players to explain what the obligations would look like and what they needed to do. One thing I know is that in the last 2 months, I'm about to speak about 4 times with different national action groups to explain to them the implications, the importance, the details and all that. So that's already beginning to happen. That's the second bulk of things. The third bulk of what's happening also is that engaging private sector more specifically. So when you start to go into a trade block, you start to also need to think of domestic mechanisms for so things like trade facilitation, things like trade remedies, things like dispute settlement. And so we're beginning to see a lot of working with private sector players to build up capacity in that area. But beyond even building up capacity with private sector, also dealing with specific agencies that have to do the roles of that. So a lot of member states are beginning to do that. And I think the fourth block of where that exists for capacity building is also in the academia. So what we're also beginning to see is that a lot of the academia around the continent are beginning to scrutinize this agreement and beginning to tease out. So I've got like 2 published papers now on the AfCFTA dispute settlement and trade remedies. And we're seeing a lot of that also where people are beginning to write more substantive articles about the details of what needs to be done. And don't remember also that even though as complicated as we want to make the system, a lot of the AfCFTA was built on the back of what the WTO looks like. The only difference was that some of the defects of the WTO, we just cured it in the agreement. So for instance, the problem with the appellate body was cured. So, and some of that. And of course, the slight more complication is that the AfCFTA covers a lot more things like investment than even the WTO agreement in how it plays out investments. But beyond that is that there's still a lot of similarity and a lot of shared learning experience, a lot of jurisprudence already exists. And so that's already beginning to happen. I think where we'll start to see is that as member states start to implement, 2 things will happen. One is that we either would have to start to go to dispute settlement a lot to resolve to understand a lot of the jurisprudential issues of what it means, right? And the second thing that happens is that member states will start to among themselves through the AfCFTA Secretariat agree on common standards around a number of things, e.g., how do I deal with goods coming into my country? So one of the things I suspect will start to happen is that each country would have to set out almost what I call a 3-window system. One is non-AfCFTA goods coming into my country, AfCFTA goods that are coming to my country that are on my on the list that I've already liberalized, and AfCFTA goods coming to my country that are on list that I've not liberalized. So those are the kind of broad thinking around how this will play out.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm actually going to go to Vimal, and maybe I'll end with Bernie. Vimal, I mean, last week I attended a lecture, and this lecturer spoke about Asia's rapid growth. And he was from Singapore, and he said, one thing that we did from the beginning in Singapore is we were pragmatic, which means let's not invent the wheel. Let's see best practice out there and copy it, basically. So we don't have to invent the right policy. We just need to see what the best policy out there and bring it to Singapore. So you spoke very clearly at the beginning about trademark East Africa and what's happening in the East African community. So I think your piece of advice is, look, guys, it's happening here. It's successful. come and speak to us. We can help you with it. But also I wanted to find out, I mean, the dialogue that you guys have with people like Trademark East Africa and the government, is it an open dialogue? And is that what's enabled the successful implementation of the free movement of goods in East Africa?
Yes, thanks, Omar. I think it's a good question. I think public-private sector dialogue is very, very crucial here, and we need to be engaging totally together with them. But at the end, I said one thing: political will is important, because we cannot become isolated to say, I am this country. We have 55 countries in Africa, 54 have signed on. And if we start behaving as 55 people negotiating internally, it's going to be difficult. And I think this is where it's crucial that we actually adopt and say, fine, what's the best practice adopted already? Take it on board and start moving with it. If we try and reinvent the wheel, we'll all go back to, look, I am a LDC, I am a developed country, I am this and I'm that, and everybody will fall back and you'll have a big problem. Number one. Number two, delay. If we're going to take this to another 10, 20 years before we get everything sorted out, we're going to lose the interest and we're going to lose the action plan. So I think this is very crucial. Number three, I think delays in sorting out TPTs. TPTs is technical barriers to trade and non-tariff barriers. Delays must be removed, and therefore the AfCFTA Secretariat must have some, what I call teeth. They must have teeth to resolve issues and sort out and give a ruling, so that you don't have any small customs officer in any border starting to say, let's mess around here. So I think that's important and crucial, because any delay in dispute resolution is going to delay everything else. And then everybody starts forming different mindsets. Again, I say one thing: political will, number one. And then, of course, everybody else must be educated. What you're doing right now is educating everybody. Everybody will have fears. In fact, when we had ESC started off, we had fears about opening up, and they'll do this and they'll do that. You will have some people fall off. You'll have some people doing it well. So I think overall, we've got to get excited that you're now becoming part of a much bigger thing. And really, I would say, let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Bernie, will final words will come from you. In terms of, I mean, Bernie looks after the supply chain director at Unilever. So he deals with the whole operations and logistics side of it, which means that, from your perspective, is there enough dialogue between policymakers and people such as yourself and also your colleagues at Unilever? And would you like to see more of that to make sure that the Continental Free Trade Agreement can become successful and can help companies such as the one that you're working for?
Yeah, so I think the responses of all the panelists gives a sounding yes. It would be great to have more dialogue in this space, to bring the continent of Africa together in order to improve trade, improve standardization, and to some of the comments I've seen in some of the chats, focus on improving our infrastructure with those aligned standards and keeping cashews inside that of Africa. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, and continue this type of work together as one. I believe, hopefully, as we start in January 2021, but definitely before 2050, we can see this really come to life. So I think this is the right start, and I'm looking forward to being part of it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bernie. Thank you to all our panelists today. Bernie Converse, Supply Chain Director at Unilever West Africa, Vimel Shah, CEO of Bidco, Adetola Onayemi, Assistant Chief Negotiator for Nigeria, Farhad Awad, founder of YYTZ Agro Processing, great growing business, and Dr. Anthony Coleman, Principal Economist at the Afri-Exim Bank. Just a little final word from me. Thank you for listening. And just to let you know that we are actually completely equal opportunities here. We support women. We support women-led businesses. And we actually did have a couple of ladies who were supposed to be on this panel, but who couldn't make it. And we'll make sure that we don't have another panel in the future. But we're pro-African, pro-diversity, and we're here to support the successful implementation of the AfCFTA. Thank you, William. I don't know if you've got any last words to say, but thank you to all our audience for participating, and see you soon.
Thank you so much for having us, Omar.
Thank you very much.
Everyone who participated.
Thank you very much so much.
Anthony, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Bye.
All right. Thank you, Omar. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.